it before, of course, so I'm just going to put it up front here, and that's my prop for today. Okay, I did hear that the introducer say that the 4 o'clock talk will be very nice to hear, but I would contend that the 2 o'clock one would be just as equally great to hear. So I'll begin by saying a few anecdotes. A mushroom that some of you may have heard. A mushroom walked into a bar. The bartender said, "Get out of here, we don't serve your kind." "Hey, what's the problem?" the mushroom asked. "Just get out of here, we don't serve mushrooms." And the mushroom in anguish says, "Why not? I'm a fun guy." And then another one. One day the zookeeper noticed that the orangutan was reading 2 books, the Bible and Darwin's On the Origin of Species. In surprise, he asked the ape, "Why are you reading both those books?" "Well," said the orangutan, "I just wanted to know I was my brother's keeper or my keeper's brother." And then finally, you have Francisco Ramo, who was born in Pamplona, Spain in 1926, and grew up during one of Spain's most turbulent periods. The Spanish Civil War and World War II left young Ramo politically conscious and disillusioned. He moved to Paris at age 20 and began experimenting with art that encompassed pre-war despair and post-war optimism. So Darwin's Ape is a fine example of Ramo's calculated irony. It reflects both a satire and a flair for the dramatic that, like so much of Ramo's work, asks questions of us all. And Ramo proudly exhibited his sculpture with the following poem called Darwin's Mistake. 3 monkeys sat in a coconut tree discussing things as they're said to be. Said one to the others, "Now listen, you two, there's a certain rumor that can't be true, that man descended from our noble race. That very idea is a disgrace. No monkey ever deserted his wife, starved her babies, or ruined her life. And another thing, you will never see a monk build a fence around a coconut tree and let the coconuts go to waste, forbidding all other monks to taste. If I put a fence around this tree, starvation would force you to steal from me. Here's another thing a monk won't do. Go out at night and get on a stew and use a gun or club or knife to take some other monkey's life. Yes, man descended, the ornery cuss, but brother, he didn't descend from us." And so that is my prop for today. All right, so it's easy to call somebody a racist, especially when they are living in the United States in the 19th century. Even though President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, he still regarded persons of African descent as inferior, barbaric, and unfit for polite white society, despite evidence to the contrary. Or we can flip the script, so to speak, and say that Lincoln was a racist, but his basic humanity and propensity towards the underdog compelled him to free the slaves, both to increase the size of the Union Army as well as to allow them to be with each other, albeit preferably in another country. We can do a similar thing with Charles Darwin. Darwin broke from the idea of the unity of humans founded in the Judeo-Christian traditions to postulate the perspective that Homo sapiens evolved over hundreds of thousands of years and were continuing to morph and progress. In his estimation, blacks were not yet at a place of civilized society. They were primordial or primitive in nature, just a step above the baboon. How could one expect him to be any different from the times in which he lived? Certainly, no one is ahead of one's time, albeit some can be more prescient or discerning than their contemporaries. Darwin, I believe, falls into this latter category. Many people superficially place Darwin in the ideological and pseudo-research camp that belittle the intelligence, apprehension, and interpersonal abilities of blacks. The eugenics mantra of the late 19th century characterized blacks as the lowest on the human totem pole, and this perception became virtually universal during the first third of the new century. Hence, the notion of survival of the fittest meant that bottom blacks were scarcely human. Consequently, they could not constructively and civilly interact with others. Jim Crow segregation and discrimination would have an ally with the evolutionary theory as supportive rationale. But was Darwin racist as we know it today? Well, that is precisely the issue, as we know it. It is fallacious to project current assessments upon historical time and personages, for we have the privilege of hindsight and need to judge the past according to the system Leben, that is to say, its original context. Both Darwin's On the Origin of Species, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, and The Descent of Man assert the underdevelopment of blacks over time that places them at a status close to, well, savagery. Yet doing so was common parlance of the day. After all, most blacks were enslaved in the United States and thought to be fit only for certain type of labor and living conditions. In the earlier work, Darwin's idea of natural selection, the mechanism of descent with modification or variation, is largely concerned about the animal world. In the latter work, Darwin theorizes that humans came from animals and that there is a common ancestry. This book did not get the same hullabaloo, if you will, that Origin had received a dozen years earlier, for the handwriting was already on the wall, so to speak. Darwin was not a proponent of scientific racism. As a matter of fact, he believed that the assignation of races is not very compelling in classifying substantial differences. He believed that the so-called races were similar, that it was not a helpful term. All human beings, he asserted, were descended from a common ancestry. The underdevelopment of some cultural groups, not races, occurred in large part because of opportunities and the ability of one group to prevail against another group, not necessarily the result of some natural selection process. When a particular civilization repeatedly bombards a lesser developed group to the point of virtual extinction, the savagery of the group is more related to the barbarism of the civilized than any kind of inferiority of the victims of approximate genocide. Darwin wrestled with the realization that the mental abilities of humans far exceeded that of apes, to the extent that the gap did not coincide or mesh well with the notion of evolutionary gradualism. However, Darwin believed he saw in animals, like monkeys and dogs, rudimentary forms of emotions and attributes such as compassion, empathy, altruism, aesthetics, rhythm, and so forth, including ethics or moral reasoning to a certain degree. Before he published On the Origin of Species, Darwin had more in common with John Brown, William Lloyd Garrison, and Frederick Douglass than he did with Abraham Lincoln and Herbert Spencer, or the burgeoning eugenicists and scientific racists of the latter part of the 19th century and beyond. Darwin vehemently opposed slavery and advocated the abolition of this evil. he developed this vitriol against slavery through his travels on the HMS Beagle during the 1830s. On a number of occasions, Darwin encountered awful experiences of cruelty to slaves. In a diary written later on in his life, he made comparisons to what he heard during his journey on the Beagle and felt even prior to that period when he was growing up, stating, "To this day, if I hear a distant scream, it recalls with painful vividness my feelings when passing a house near Pernambuco. I heard the most pitiable moans and could not but suspect that some poor slave was being tortured, yet know that I was powerless as a child even to remonstrate." By posturing a common ancestry among humans, I concur with Adrian Desmond and James Moore's thesis that these experiences of slavery inclined Darwin to his perspective in their book, Darwin's Sacred Cause, How a Hatred of Slavery Shaped Darwin's Views on Human Evolution. This position of Darwin's manifested itself in the postulation of the fraternal and sororal nature of humanity. A contributing writer of The New Yorker, Adam Gopchik, also agrees with Desmond and Moore that Darwin was not a racist and compares him favorably with Abraham Lincoln as an eloquent writer and one who had a tragic consciousness birthed by the death of a child, but with an eternal sense of hope. Darwin was born in a well-off Whig family that held strong anti-slavery views, which Darwin similarly held throughout his life. It probably is not appreciated by many that Darwin might have been influenced by his humanitarian, religious, and familial values in his science, which luckily tended to corroborate his assertion of a common ancestry and a niceness towards community. Surely Darwin's work on plants and animals were always grounded in his belief in human evolution and his propensity towards sympathy. Darwin is no longer merely scientist, but also moralist. Darwin, born into an Anglican family, at one point aimed to become a minister. Over time, perhaps, he moved from having an intense theism to skepticism about creative design, and from deism to an inconsistent agnosticism. However, Darwin did not ever seem to hold an ardent atheism or to ascribe meaninglessness to anyone's religious faith or leaning. He may have minimized one pole of Albrecht Ritschl's ellipsis concerning religion, where one side was theology. However, Darwin appeared to have an ongoing and well-developed certainty of the other side of Ritschl's schematic, which was ethics. So Ritschl looked at religion as having on one pole theology and the other pole ethics. So Darwin was not as inclined to focus on the theology side, but certainly he developed a strong sense of the ethical side. Whether it stemmed from the desire for attention, the ambition to please others, the vanity of being accepted, to the manipulative ploy to be first, Darwin suggested that the evolutionary dialectic, if you will, certainly pointed to, in some higher animals and definitely in humans, the development of a moral sense, that is to say, a conscience. The belief in a conscience and earnest receptivity to ideas such as the golden rule show a sensibility for doing good, living well, and helping others along the way. Whereas oftentimes this helping others meant having sympathy for those who did not have all the skills necessary to be fully productive and functioning citizens, it also suggested being a bit of the infracaninophile, which means a lover or friend of the underdog. Hence, this may explain Darwin's fervent abolitionist stance, his response to personal tragedy, his postponement of publicly ascribing evolution to the human sphere, and his notion of a common ancestry and the familial nature of all humanity. So an understanding of Darwin's evolutionary theory and moral sensibilities should lead one not to a belief in the perfection of the Prussian state, for example, as often inaccurately derived from Hegel, minus the conceptual ideal of an absolute mind. Rather, it should impel us toward an appreciation for the beauty of diversity, an altruism that does not seek to assign blame, but rather to identify causes, and a recognition that we all make mistakes, regardless of our status, our station, our intellectual abilities, and whatnot. It is to transcend the simple stereotyping of categories of people, or realizing that no ascription covers the entirety of culture, and no group is ever really monolithic. It is the understanding that society plays a significant role in the life chances and achievement opportunities of a tribe, village, neighborhood, and so forth, and that the intrusion of external factors and the degree of invasive control or oppression and exploitation determine the calculus of why certain people in a particular group, even to an overwhelming extent, may be behind others at a given period of time. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great transcendentalist philosopher, wrote a poem called Sacrifice that goes like this. Though love repine and reason chafe, there came a voice without reply. 'Tis man's perdition to be safe, when for the truth he ought to die. Darwin may not have been the sharpest tack on the bulletin board of evolutionary theorists, if you will. He may have borrowed considerably from others and owed a debt of gratitude to the evolutionary thinking of predecessors and his contemporaries. But I dare say, in one thing, he got it right. I remember when I was in Atlanta, Georgia, matriculating at the Morehouse School of Religion, a constituent seminary of the Interdenominational Theological Center, and becoming a licensed preacher at the celebrated Ebenezer Baptist Church. A fellow alumnus from my undergraduate school, Wesleyan University, was simultaneously attending the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. One day I was sharing with him how a single mother had come to me with financial woes, and I sought to help her with my meager personal funds, as well as to solicit help from the church to no avail. He quickly told me that we each have to pull our own weight, take care of ourselves, and work out our salvation with fear and trembling. I was appalled, especially since the purpose of my visit to his apartment was to loan him a book that he needed, but did not want to purchase. Realizing his own hypocrisy and the overwhelming altruistic thrust of the biblical witness, he sputtered and stammered for the rest of my visit. And then I quoted to him a series of poetic utterances which I think reflect the posture of our ontological subject today. The first is from Isaiah, the 58th chapter. Is this not the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your fellow human beings? John Donne caught it long ago when he said in his Meditation 17, no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as a manner of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I'm involved in humankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. In the 1960s, Ian Ferguson wrote a poem that became a hymn based on Cain's killing of his brother Abel and the asking of the question, am I my brother's keeper? It reads, am I my brother's keeper? Am I my brother's keeper? The mother cried, was drowned. by Abel's lifeblood shouting and silence from the ground. For no man is an island divided from the main. The bell which tolled for Abel tolled equally for Cain. The ruler called for water and thought his hands were clean. Christ counted less than order, the man than the machine. The crowd cried, "Crucify him." Their malice wouldn't budge. So Pilate called for water, and history's his judge. As long as people hunger, as long as people thirst, and ignorance and illness and warfare do their worst, as long as there's injustice in any of God's lands, I am my brother's keeper. I dare not wash my hands. Or we can listen to the sound of Emily Dickinson, who said, if I can stop one heart from breaking, I shall not live in vain. If I can ease one life the aching, or cool one pain, or help one fainting robin unto his nest again, I shall not live in vain. When Martin Luther King Jr. preached his own eulogy, in a way, in a sermon entitled The Drum Major Instinct, he concluded by saying, if I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with a word or song, if I can show somebody he is traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. If I can do my duty as a Christian ought, if I can bring salvation to a world once wrought, if I can spread the message as the Master taught, then my living shall not be in vain. Despite the fundamentalist critique of Darwin that continues to today, the evolutionary theory of Charles Darwin had some of his staunchest supporters in the Christian fold, particularly Asa Gray here in the States, who argued for a creative deity that set in motion natural selection processes. There was no substantial objection to Darwin's burial in Westminster Abbey in April 1882. Darwin had a knack for self-deprecation and realizing his own limitations and counting on hope for the future and challenging and revising contemporaneous ineptitude. While that uncertainty continues, perhaps, we should dispose ourselves for accepting everyone in the human family, be they physically challenged, mentally impaired, gay or straight, left-handed, variously gendered, female or male, poor or rich, short or tall, fat or skinny, blue-eyed or brown-eyed, white, yellow, red, brown, or black. Like Darwin, we should continue to advocate against the humiliation or dehumanization of any other person and work for the betterment of all people. Perhaps this pithy doggerel I like so well poignantly captures the point I'm trying to make herein. There's so much good in the worst of us, and so much bad in the best of us, that it doesn't behoove any of us to find much fault in the rest of us. So all we can really expect is for people to put on compassion as they recognize we're all in this boat called life together. We should recognize, like that poem of old, fleecy locks and black complexion cannot forfeit nature's claim. Skin may differ, but affection dwells in black and white the same. Were I so tall as to reach the pole, or to grasp the ocean at a span, I must be measured by my soul. The mind is standard of the man. So in the final analysis, the most important thing is that we seek to develop our sympathetic instincts as we move forward from one generation to the next. As Albert Einstein opined, it has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity. Martin Luther King similarly lamented that the means by which we live have outdistanced the ends for which we live. Our scientific power has outrun our spiritual power. We have guided missiles and misguided men. He has allowed civilization to outdistance his culture. Man has allowed his mentality to outrun his morality. He has allowed his technology to outdistance his theology. So I close by urging that we seek to do the best that we can, that we do what we can with what we have. As Douglas Malloch proposed in a nice little poem, if you can't be a pine on the top of the hill, be a shrub in the valley, but be. The best little scrub by the side of the rill, be a bush if you can't be a tree. If you can't be a bush, be a bit of the grass in some highway, happier mate. If you can't be a muskie, then just be a bass, but the liveliest bass in the lake. We can't all be captains. Some have to be crew. There's room for all of us here. There's big work to do and there's little to do, and the task we must do is the near. If you can't be a highway, just be a trail. If you can't be the sun, be a star. For it isn't by size that you win or you fail. Be the best of whatever you are. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has them, raise them up. In the back?
Yeah, you might have touched on this early on and I just missed it, but I seem to encounter often among religious individuals, not all, but some, the idea that Darwin or even not even him, but just like the science that he worked on is like inherently racist, and I'm wondering where you think that comes from, because I think your stuff was pretty compelling about why it's not true, but I'm just wondering where it stems from, that misconception.
Well, I do think that that the whole notion that slaves were barbaric and close to savagery certainly helped. But a lot of people, I think, veered from what Charles Darwin really was doing, and which started the whole eugenics movement, and up to where you even have Charles Murray, in the 1990s, coming up with the bell curve and talking about IQ and whatnot, and doing basically the same thing, which was saying that there are certain groups of people who are inferior intellectually than others, and so trying to base it on science. So I think that it just corrupted really what Darwin was trying to do by basing things on a common ancestry, and actually starting to say that races were developed separately. And by saying that they were developed separately, of course, then you can say that this group is inferior to and less than. And I think that helped to develop a further rationale for separating people, segregating people, and so forth. So I think it was a veering off of really what at least Darwin was trying to do. I think that there were certainly other people who supported evolutionary theory that also had in their ulterior motive of trying to lift up a particular race of people, and also, I think later on they tried to connect Darwin with the thinking of Adolf Hitler and Nazism and all that kind of stuff, and I think that's a corruption of really at least what Darwin was trying to do.
Other questions?
You said that Darwin was an agnostic but not an ardent atheist. I just want to know how you're defining agnostic and atheist when you say that.
Well, I think just traditionally, I mean, an agnostic is one who has doubt, isn't certain whether God exists. And an atheist is, someone that believes there is no God. So I don't think that Darwin ever.
I just wondered about that, because my impression from what I've read is that agnostic originally meant that it couldn't be known. And so I wondered if you thought that Darwin thought it could not be known, and that kind of puts a damping on your thinking in science if you think something can't be known. Yes, we don't know it. An atheist, from what I've read, is what everybody called whatever group they weren't in. I mean, some of the Christians were called atheists, in the past. And that's why I wanted to know your definition.
Yes. I think that the more Darwin got involved in doing research, the less he certainly focused on his initial Christianity, and and a lot of times we view God as being omnipotent and all-knowing and everywhere, right? And I think that Darwin did not necessarily believe that you could draw a direct line between looking at the beauty of a forest to a belief in a God. But I think that he left room some aspect of a creative process, that evolution, one can believe in both evolution and in a deity, and that I think he bared a lot from the whole notion of creative design, but I think that he was still uncertain, and I think that's why that's why I would say that he was more so agnostic than anything else as he developed in doing research and writing.
I question the ardent atheists, because the atheists I know don't think that they'll always necessarily know. They just want evidence, but they aren't agnostic, because agnostic tended to mean you couldn't know. I mean, it couldn't be known. But hey, when I was a little girl, we knew we weren't going to the moon.
Did we go to the moon? No, just kidding. I know a lot of people who believed at the time that we weren't there, right?
Some of them doubted it.
They thought that it was some soap opera, some weird soap opera taking place, but I tried to convince them otherwise. I don't know whether I succeeded. But.
Any other questions?
It sounded like you are, I don't know if this is what you're actually suggesting, but more of a wider boundary in terms of almost universalism or moral universalism in terms of extending our group boundaries. And I was just wondering if that was consistent with kind of a shared moralism that helped our ancestors form communities or tribes that helped them cooperate on a smaller level, if there's any negative consequences of having to extend those morals to larger multicultural or dissonant groups that may not be as apt to share our morals.
Well, I believe that one can hold fervently to a particular value system or whatnot that differs from another and still embrace the other and can live side by side with one another. Because, as long as you believe that no one has, absolute truth, that there's always room to have some cross-fertilization of ideas and learn from each other and try to understand the other. There are some people that are trying to make the case that Darwin was, acquainted with Buddhism, and the whole idea of sympathy and compassion in part derives from a Buddhist orientation. Well, I'm not sure whether that is actually the case, but I say that to say that there are certain things in other people's belief system that one can adopt, even though it is not in line with or coincides directly with one's own value system, and still live together. So, I advocate for a pluralistic, inclusive society that will not. Now, certainly, of course, people who use their differences in order to fight each other and lord it over each other. But I think that there's another approach that's a lot better, and that is to embrace all people, realize your differences, but do not let that cause you to be at each other's throats, so to speak. Yes.
Any other questions? All right. Well, could you help me thank Dr. Blackwell one more time?